Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up because the leadership of the IRS has just changed hands again. And this time, the move has everyone talking. The Trump administration has replaced the IRS Commissioner yet again, the fifth change in just 8 months of Trump's second term. And this isn't just a routine reshuffle. Behind the headlines, it's part of a much bigger and frankly more ambitious plan to reshape, maybe even abolish, the IRS as we know it. Now, some people are celebrating, others are furious. And as usual, the truth is more complicated than either side admits. So let's break it down. On August 8, 2025, President Trump fired Billy Long, who had been IRS Commissioner for less than 2 months, and appointed Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as acting commissioner. At first glance, you might think, wow, that's a quick fall from grace. But here's the twist. Long wasn't exactly demoted. Instead, he was appointed U.S. Ambassador to Iceland, a post that carries ambassador-level prestige and reports directly to the President and the Secretary of State. Long himself took to social media to say how thrilled he was, calling Trump a good friend and pledging to push forward his bold agenda from Reykjavik. And given Long's personality, he's a former talk show host, he couldn't resist a joke about how Trump misheard him wanting to join ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, as saying he wanted to go to Iceland. Classic Billy Long humor. If you've been following the IRS under Trump's second term, you know this isn't an isolated event. In just 8 months, we've seen a revolving door at the top. Danny Werfel, a Biden appointee, resigned the day Trump took office, saying he knew his role in expanding the IRS with $80 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act was dead in the water. Doug O'Donnell, an acting commissioner, stepped down after refusing to share data on 700,000 illegal immigrants with DHS. Melanie Krause left for the same reason. Gary Shapley, a former IRS whistleblower, lasted only days, reportedly due to Elon Musk's involvement in his appointment. Then came Billy Long, now off to Iceland, and now Scott Bessent steps in. So what's going on? Is this chaos, or is it a calculated strategy? To understand, we need to step back. Trump has made it no secret that he wants to shrink the IRS drastically, and maybe ultimately replace it altogether. Since returning to the White House, he's fired thousands. Nearly 7,000 IRS employees have been laid off, about a quarter of the workforce since January. Slashed the budget. Congress has folded steep IRS funding cuts into its budget plans, floated an entirely new model. The U.S. External Revenue Service, which would collect tariffs, external taxes, and trade-related revenues, instead of taxing Americans directly. Back in January, even before taking office, Trump posted on Truth Social, "For far too long, we have relied on taxing our great people using the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. Through soft and pathetically weak trade agreements, the American economy has delivered growth and prosperity to the world, while taxing ourselves. It is time for that to change. I am today announcing that I will create the External Revenue Service to collect our tariffs, duties, and all revenue that come from foreign sources. We will begin charging those that make money off of us with trade, and they will start paying, finally, their fair share." January 20th, 2025 will be the birth date of the External Revenue Service. Make America great again. The vision is clear. Make other countries, and those who profit from America's markets, pay their fair share, while lowering, maybe even eliminating, federal income taxes for Americans. The United States didn't always have a federal income tax. It was first introduced in 1861 during the Civil War as a temporary measure. It lapsed after a decade, and Americans went back to a tax-free life, at least in terms of federal income tax, until 1913. That's when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Revenue Act, creating a permanent income tax to make up for lost revenue after tariffs were cut. In other words, 1913 was about lowering tariffs and taxing Americans instead. Trump's plan flips that on its head. raising tariffs to reduce or eliminate domestic taxes. Let's be honest, the IRS has never been a beloved institution. For many Americans, especially conservatives, it represents government overreach, endless paperwork, and the looming threat of an audit. And there's a reason Trump's message resonates. Over the decades, especially as global trade expanded, the IRS became bigger, more complex, and, in the eyes of critics, more aggressive. It now even has armed enforcement officers, a detail that fuels fears of a militarized tax agency. Democrats argue that cutting IRS staff will make it harder to collect taxes from wealthy individuals and corporations who exploit loopholes. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Tim Kaine warned in a letter that reducing staff means fewer people to audit wealthy tax cheats and collect revenue to offset the deficit. On paper, this sounds reasonable, but here's the key issue. Multinational corporations are masters at hiding profits in tax havens. Even if we doubled the IRS workforce, the reality is that complex international accounting structures often make enforcement nearly impossible. Yes, it's true that corporate tax avoidance is a huge problem. It's also true that middle-class Americans end up shouldering a disproportionate share of the tax burden when corporate taxes fall short. In that sense, the conservative argument for fundamentally rethinking the tax system, rather than just hiring more IRS agents, is worth considering. However, and this is important, shrinking the IRS without reforming the tax code can create its own problems. Without sufficient enforcement, not just rich tax cheats, but also ordinary non-compliant taxpayers may slip through the cracks, widening the gap between what's owed and what's collected. That can ultimately force the government to either cut services or raise taxes elsewhere. So yes, Trump's reform push might make the system fairer in theory, but it will require precise execution to avoid unintended consequences. Republicans have long accused the IRS of political bias, pointing to incidents where taxpayer data was leaked, including Trump's own, and where audits seem to target political opponents. This isn't new. Back in 1969, Nixon tried to use the IRS to audit his enemies. A White House memo at the time explicitly said the IRS could achieve what the courts could not. Whether you believe the modern IRS is weaponized or not, these stories reinforce the conservative argument for reducing its power. But from a balanced perspective, it's worth noting, any enforcement body, from the FBI to the SEC, can be abused if proper safeguards aren't in place. Reform should aim to prevent abuse, not just shrink capacity. Now, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary turned acting IRS Commissioner, is a trusted member of Trump's inner circle. He's calm, measured, and methodical. He may not share Trump's tendency for public bombast, but he's committed to advancing the MAGA agenda. In testimony before the House Appropriations Committee, Bessent emphasized cutting unnecessary budgets and staff, making Trump's 2017 tax cuts permanent, strengthening tariff policy, introducing AI into tax collection and customer service to improve efficiency, saving $2 billion in expenses without disrupting operations. This isn't just about smaller government. It's about aligning tax policy directly with trade policy and keeping Treasury in the driver's seat. If Trump and Bessent succeed, the IRS of the future may be a very different beast, leaner, more tech-driven, less focused on domestic income tax, and possibly absorbed into a new external revenue service. For Trump supporters, that's the dream. No more April 15th dread. No more fear of an audit over your Venmo transactions. And a tax system that makes foreign freeloaders pay up. For critics, it's a risky gamble that could shift revenue instability onto trade flows and tariffs. But one thing is certain. The IRS, as an institution, is now firmly in the crosshairs. And every leadership change, every budget cut, every public statement is moving it closer to the chopping block. Love him or hate him, Trump is playing the long game here. Each high-profile firing, each dramatic announcement about tariffs and tax reform keeps the spotlight on a deeply unpopular institution. And if history is any guide, public opinion, not just policy details, will be the deciding factor in whether the IRS survives in its current form. Whether you think this is the start of a tax revolution or just another Washington shakeup, one thing is undeniable. We're witnessing one of the most aggressive attempts in modern history to rewrite the rules of how America collects and who America collects from. And that's a story worth paying attention to.